Hello everyone. Today I want to address Terry's question. All right, computer, come back. Terry's question based on communism. All right. So the first thing that we need to say about this is communism versus socialism. Okay. So communism is the most extreme interpretation of this political system, and it stands for commune, everything being owned communally, right? Especially the private property, not private property, especially the means of production. Remember, we talked all about this a couple of chapters ago. The means of production is how we meet our needs in society. It's the tools in society. And in a communist system, those tools are owned by everyone. Okay? So you might live in your house, but the house is owned by everyone. You might work at a factory, but the factory is owned by everyone. You might work at a public state university, and that university is owned by everyone. That's what communism means. Okay, socialism is similar, but is a little bit less extreme, and things aren't owned communally. In fact, you still have a lot of private property in socialism, but the government takes, let me say it this way, the government endeavors to help individuals meet their needs, which is different. So in communism, everything is owned by the government, and since the government everything's owned by everyone, since everyone is represented by the government, then the government owns and manages everything. In socialism, the government might run healthcare, in which case the hospitals and the clinics are owned by the government, and the government takes care of those hospitals and clinics. The other way to do it would be to have hospitals and clinics be privately owned, and the government contract out and pay for them. But either way, the government doesn't own everything. The government endeavors to help its citizens meet specific needs. Okay, so that's communism versus socialism. Now, in the United States, communism and socialism both have a very, very, very bad reputation, essentially for a few reasons. The first is that the large-scale experiments, and this is utterly, utterly, utterly important here, the first large-scale experiments in communism have not just been failures, they have been evil monstrosities, if I can use that and I'm a pretty value-neutral person when it comes to these things. You won't hear me say that often in class, but I would have to say the numbers on this page would represent evil monstrosities. As much as in the United States we dislike Hitler, if you ever want to make an argument about supreme evil, Hitler's the worst that you can come up with. The fact is that Hitler wasn't really that bad in terms of how bad evil dictators can get. Under Hitler's Holocaust, approximately 6 million people were dead. Well, both the Chinese and the Russians beat that with their communist experiments. All right. So the Russian experiment started in 1917. It was the October Revolution, and it was run by the Bolshevik Party. It lasted until 1989 when the wall fell. The first part, and I'm not strong on Russian history at all, but the first part was worse than the second part in terms of sheer outright death and destruction. But it still wasn't great in the second part. If you are interested in reading about this, there are some very important and interesting writers. One of the famous is, it's Russian, I can't pronounce it, Alexei Skolnikov. It's called The Gulag Archipelago. Let's pull that up here. The Gulag Archipelago. Bam. All right. Come on, computer. Here it is, the Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and it was written in 1973. And the whole thing is about the extensive system of political prisons that the Russians had, and that was in the second part when things were supposedly better, right? So that was the Russian experiment. It's hard to actually get a number. I pulled 20 million. Some estimates are much higher than that. Some estimates are lower than that. This seemed like an in-between estimate, so it's what I went with. There's a lot there. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to study if you want. Let's skip the Cubans and let's go straight to the Chinese. So the Chinese experiment, also hard to call a success. And Mao was the character who ran, who was mostly responsible for the Chinese dead. That revolution started in 1949. And China is still theoretically a communist country, although you'll notice that the communism is starting to shrink and the economy is loosening up to have some very, very capitalistic elements. Nevertheless, the political system is still communist, and most Chinese are fairly careful about what they say, at least as near as I can tell, about their governments because you don't have government competition whatsoever, not like us. Okay. Mao's estimates are somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 million, and for both of these, for both Mao and the Russians, Stalin and Lenin, the only way that you could end up with that many millions dead, it wasn't just that you executed your political prisoners and schemed against your political competition, although they certainly did that. It was also that forcing changes in economy and society in both situations, in both countries, drove massive, massive, massive famines. For the Russians, soon after the Bolshevik Revolution, you'll have to look up the exact dates if you want them, there was an attempt to collectivize the farms to get away from small farm holdings to large industrial farms that were owned and operated by the government. In doing that, a series of famines were set off that killed millions of people over a couple of winters, and you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. The Russians are the ones that came up with the statement, a very famous but terrifying quote: "The death of a single man is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic." All right, the Chinese, very similar thing. We're talking a little bit of a later time period. Be quiet, phone. It's the professor's phone making noises. In the Chinese experiment, I do believe that there was still killing of political opponents. There was still all of that. But my understanding, and I could be wrong, you're going to have to look into it yourself if you want to know for certain, but my understanding that tremendous number of deaths in the Chinese experiment happened when Mao was making the Great Leap Forward. And essentially he was trying to radically change the farming system, the culture, everything all at once, sending intellectuals off to the countryside to farm where they'd be out of the way and wouldn't be able to be obnoxious intellectuals, and wouldn't be able to be arrogant upper class intellectuals, collectivizing things, and the result again were famines where millions and millions of people died. So when you start talking about communism in the United States, these are the first examples that Americans jump to, and it's important because these are serious, serious human tragedies that can't be overstated. The Cuban experiment, I don't think I mean, the Cuban experiment certainly had people who were killed. Some people will point to it as a success, but it's the kind of success that goes in air quotes. After the Cuban experiment, I remember reading a thing that said that the average person lost about 17 pounds. They're loosening trade with Cuba right now, but folks that snuck over there would say that they had cars from the 50s and 60s that they managed to keep running with duct tape and baling wire. Everyone was poorer because they weren't able to trade with the outside world. So there you go. It was successful in that they have something that looks like a communist society, but amidst quite a bit of poverty, and that's, you can't get around that. Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to point out is what the difference between socialism and communism is. The second thing is I wanted to point to these, the Russian and the Chinese are the big experiments, lots and lots and lots of dead people. The Cuban experiment, more of a success, but a qualified success at the very best. But at least there weren't millions and millions and millions and millions of people killed. Okay, so that leads us to communism in the United States. Now, communism in the United States is a little bit tricky. The first point here, 1930s had a growth of communism as a political movement. This shouldn't be surprising. Remember that in 1929, the economy flat collapsed, right? And during the 20s, if you go back and read your recent American history, the 1920s are the Gilded Age, it's the Jazz Age, it's prohibition and speakeasies and gangsters. It kind of sounds like a lot of fun, but what you miss on that is that the people who are not doing well are actually left out of the game. If you wanted to draw a parallel, it's sort of like talking about the U.S. before the 2008 crash. In the 90s and in the 2000s, the people who were doing well, bankers, real estate brokers, financiers, Wall Street folks, they were doing awesome. But if you were at the bottom, you weren't necessarily doing well, and even when you thought you were doing well, you were often doing worse. If it was in 2003 or 2004 and you're a working class person and you went out and got an adjustable rate mortgage, you might feel well-to-do for a little while. But in truth, things are going to get much worse for you soon. Okay? So that's like the 1930s. The 1930s, I want to say that the membership got up to something like 1 million, and it was a real honest political force. This didn't have to do with Russia necessarily. This had to do with how do we take care of the working classes in the United States. The second thing about this, and head on over to Wiki if you want to read about it, but the communist period, or the communist growth in the United States was closely linked with the American labor movements. And you'll notice we talked about the labor movements a couple of lectures back, again talking about things like the 40-hour work week, the 8-hour day, the weekend, the idea that you have overtime, things like workplace protection. It's fun to make fun of OSHA when they want you to wear a stupid hat. It's another thing to remember that before those kinds of laws, you might work in a slaughterhouse with no protection whatsoever, and once you cut your hand, you're infected and you're out of a job. Okay, so plus the American labor movement through the whole period of the early 1900s, maybe even late 1800s, but not so much. I'm going to say the early 1900s. The whole period of the whole experience of the U.S. labor movement was very, very violent. It's not just that people were nervous. Let's see, how do we say this? It's not just that it was hard to push forward a labor-oriented agenda. It's that the people who were opposed to that labor-oriented agenda hired private security who sometimes killed people. So the American labor movement the history of American labor is this wonderfully violent. There's fights, there's riots, there's strikes and scabs. The first police forces in the United States were actually hired security who killed people, right? So it was kind of a mess. Very fun to read. Go over and read about it. You'll hear about the red bandanas. You'll hear about the wobblies. It's exciting. Okay. Now, but that's communism as a political movement in and up to the 30s. Through the Great Depression, I don't know that a ton happened. By the time they got to World War II, people just had other things to worry about. Now, after World War II, our focus on communism pops back up, but it's not a labor versus owners. It's almost entirely a top-down anti-communism push. Now, why was this? Well, it's because the Russians had, remember, 1917 had the Bolshevik Revolution. So the Russians had been communist since the First World War. Okay? And the Cold War with the United States and Russia started as soon as we got out of World War II, almost right away. As long as Hitler was bad, then the enemy of my enemy was my friend. But as soon as Hitler was toast, then the enemy of my enemy went back to being my enemy. Which sounds, say that 5 times fast. Okay, now, strategically, what the United States was trying to do throughout the 50s was contain Russian expansion. What Russia was trying to do throughout the United States, or throughout the 50s, was grow. 50s, 60s, and 70s was grow. And so there were a series of proxy wars. This is why it was a Cold War. We had hot wars going on, just not against Russia. It was against Russian holdings, right, or places that were influenced by Russia. So we had the Korean War. Well, the Korean War was an anti-commie war. Well, I guess I should say China was on but they were communists at this time. China was on the one side. They were influencing Korea. We were fighting on the other side as the anti-commies for South Korea. And that war went along for a while. You'll notice Terry mentioned it, talking about MASH. Yes, I grew up watching reruns of that when I was a kid. So you had Korea, which was a proxy war between us and the communists, the Chinese communists. Then you had Vietnam in the late 60s and early 70s, which was a proxy war between us and the Russians, right? And so we're fighting from the south, the north. You can't see my hands. The north Vietnamese were getting support from the communists. But we didn't bomb China. We didn't bomb the Russians. We bombed Vietnam. They didn't bomb us. They bombed Vietnam. So we had our pawns fighting, if you will, the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese, the North Koreans and the South Koreans. All right. By the time you get to the 80s, this whole theater shifts to Latin America, and Latin America had some communist movement, and we were involved all through we were involved all throughout Latin America, again, trying to contain that communist threat. People would talk about the domino theory. You heard this pop up again in our recent Middle East adventure. But the idea was, if you had a freestanding state and a state here goes commie, then that political instability is going to tip into this one, which is going to tip into this one and this one. And if we could be on the other side and push South Vietnam to be our version of democratic, then hopefully that would push the dominoes the other way. I'm not sure if the domino theory ever works. It certainly seems to, well, who knows about the Middle East now. Okay, so the whole thing there was to stop Russian expansion. Now, it was also to stop communist expansion, but you're stuck with a really tricky question. It's a little bit like race and poverty in the United States. Are the problems we have racial problems, or are they income problems, right? Well, there's so much overlap that you can't really talk about one without the other, but they're not the same. Are we trying to understand? I had another example just went bing right into my head. Are we trying to understand? Where did it go? That's embarrassing. Maybe it'll come to me. But communism as a political idea, as advocated by Marx, isn't necessarily the same thing as our geopolitical strategies to contain the Russian threat using communism, right? If that makes sense. Okay, so we want to control Russia. The Russians are communist. Those are two different things, but they overlap enough that you're really stuck with it. You're stuck with trying to pull the two apart, and I'm just not sure how to actually do that. Okay, so the next point I want to bring up here is McCarthyism. I do believe Terry had mentioned that. So most people nowadays think of McCarthyism as sort of a bad thing, or at least I've never heard anybody refer to it positively. And what McCarthy was doing is he was, well, as it says here, he was on a political witch hunt. He stood up, had a list of supposed American communists, and started going through Congress, started going through media, important media people, trying to figure out anyone who was a communist, right? Now, think about the problem here, though, what I just said between the Soviets as a geopolitical threat and communism as a political idea. We in the United States believe in political freedom, right? But we don't believe in treason. So if you're an American communist and it's 1950, what does that mean? Does that mean you believe in a social welfare state? In which case, who cares? Or does it mean you are actively helping the Russians, which would be treason? I don't have an answer to that. I suspect McCarthy thought he was addressing treason. History hasn't treated him that kindly. When we look back at it, we look back and see a political witch hunt that actually shut down free political expression in the United States. Very un-American. All right. Now, that leads me to a couple of favorites. The Pledge of Allegiance. So for all the talk of God, and you'll see this on Facebook over and over and over again, I'm sure all of us have that relative that puts up the American flag and says, if you believe in God we trust should be in the pledge, please post this to your Facebook wall. Okay, well, we might have forgotten, but this really was never about God in the first place. First of all, under God wasn't even in the original Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag, to the state, not to God, just to the state, because I'm an American citizen, right? But if you pay attention, or if you know anything about Marx's first writings on communism, Marx didn't like religion. We already talked about that a wee little bit. Saw religion as a way to distract people from political truths. And so Marx and all of the states that were built on Marx's ideas were essentially, they had to be atheists. So, all of those states that we just mentioned worked to actually try and shut down the churches. A lot of religious oppression in those communities as well. Okay, so if you think about how quickly people get emotional in a debate about religion, think about how powerful throwing God into our state things is going to be in terms of propaganda, right? So if we're fighting the Russians, and the Russians are communist, and they're atheist, and we want to remind our population that, in fact, we're fighting those godless atheists, how important would it be, or how effective would it be to actually include some of these statements into our state documents, right? So one nation, indivisible, under God, that ends up going into the pledge in 1954. The height of McCarthyism, the height of the Cold War. It was still going to go on for several decades, but that was when it was pinged up here. Same thing with In God We Trust. Get out your dollar bill, look at it. It'll say In God We Trust. It also says E pluribus unum. Sometimes I think we have trouble with the pluribus part of that, but that doesn't matter. So it says In God We Trust. Is this because our money comes from God? Is this because we're a religious nation? No, it's because the people who run things wanted you to remember you're not a godless commie. You have nothing to do with those bad guys we're fighting over there. Now, the Russian threat is long since diminished. Maybe it's coming back again, who knows. But the Russian threat is long since diminished. Those artifacts remain in our Pledge of Allegiance and on our money, and this whole discussion has come up about whether it is a Judeo-Christian country. You can have that discussion, but one nation under God and In God We Trust on our money really aren't about that. They're about our leaders propagandizing us away from that relationship with the commies, the Russians. Okay? I wonder if there was another point there. Now, so I said that you've got the Russian geopolitical strategy here, and how do we deal with that? But then you've also got these ideas of communism over here, which are simply political ideas and really shouldn't be too much of a problem. I know what I was going to say here. Also, and think about this, given the way the United States is organized, given what you saw in the 1% video, what you read about the upper classes in the United States, what you understand about actual wealth and who in the United States owns the means of production, can you imagine that the people in control would push back against communism using whatever means they could? Of course they are. That anything that's communist in any sort of way completely threatens those holders of wealth, those holders of power, our American elites, right? But again, if you can hide that threat and that pushback against that threat behind something like religion, behind something like patriotism, instead of addressing it as a political idea, well, it's just that much more effective. Patriotism and religion sell themselves. You don't even have to have the political argument. That's what I was going to say. Okay. So now I wanted you to think, I wanted to make a point here, though, is that these guys, oh, let's also put this here. No. All right. So the whole idea of communism is simply that things are owned in common. And while the Russian experiment, disaster for many millions of people, and the Chinese experiment, disaster for even more millions of people, if we actually look around, divorce ourselves from those examples and from anything, just putting judgment on the value judgments on the back burner for a moment, can we find other examples of ownership, of societies organized around ownership being something done in common? And the answer there is all the time, right? And so these three or four things here are elements of essentially communist organization. Not communist with a capital C having anything to do with the Russians, having anything to do with the Communist Party, but communist with a small c as simply a description of the way things are organized, right? So the very first one, I had to use this one because it's the oldest one I could come up with, is the rule of St. Benedict. So we've always had religious groups who were set aside, lived on their own. And if you hang out with the Catholics, one of the oldest religious groups in Catholicism is in fact the Benedictines. The Benedictines were set up by St. Benedict, and he wrote a little book called The Rule of St. Benedict right around 500 AD, which means this has been used by people for 1,500 years, and yes, I had to read it in college, right alongside the Communist Manifesto from sociology class. Now, what was really intriguing to me about the Rule of St. Benedict is it essentially mirrors many aspects of the Communist Manifesto. So what I put here are simply 3 of the more important ideas behind Benedict that would be communist ideas. So first of all, you give up your personal property. If you go to a Benedictine monastery, people don't really own stuff. I mean, maybe they own their sandals, and maybe they own their robes. Hopefully they own their underwear. But the room is provided, the bed is provided, the tools to do their work is provided. If they have to do grounds work, they go out and they drive the pickup owned by the monastery out to the grounds owned by the monastery. They use the shovels owned by the monastery to till the garden, whose fruits and veggies are owned by the monastery. You get the idea. They don't own anything, but they also don't need to own anything. They're not supposed to develop attachments to things, and so you don't own anything. Because you don't actually own the means of production, you don't own the pickup, you don't own the shovel, you don't own your room. You also don't own the fruits of your labor, but that's okay because the fruits of your labor belong to the community. If you're tilling fields using the material or the tools that the monastery gave you, then the wheat that's grown is all owned by the monastery that is owned by the same monastery. And when that wheat is ground into bread, some of it's sold, that cash goes to the monastery, some of it's made into bread. Oh, I said ground to bread, ground to flour. Some of the flour is made into monk bread. That's owned by the monastery. You get to avail yourself of the bread at dinner time, and the monastery is going to use that cash to do whatever the monastery needs to do, and your needs are met, right? But not because you own anything within the monastery. Now, look at how point number 2 is work according to your ability. So if you're young and healthy and you're in the monastery, you're going to be expected to put a lot of work in. But if you join a monastery and you stay your whole life, at some point you're going to be old, no one's going to expect an old man to be doing 8 or 10 hours a day of manual labor in the fields. It's ridiculous. That old man, either he's going to have a lighter work duty, or he's going to be in retirement, like serious retirement, waiting to get buried in the monastery-owned funeral plot. Okay, now I already made this point, but your needs were met by the order. So you went into this and you never had to worry about this stuff because they met your needs. This matches a very famous communist line. Let's see if we can pull it up. From each, from each according to his ability. To each according to his need, right? And look at where this comes over here. It's in a series on Marxism. So clearly, what you have going on in the Rule of St. Benedict is something that at least echoes Marx's communism. But you'll notice it precedes Marx's communism by about 1,300 years. 1,400 years. So, in fact, Marx's communism very much echoes the Rule of St. Benedict. Okay, so the family, I think this one's kind of an intriguing one. Now, I don't know about you and about your family, but we go out, we buy milk, it goes in the fridge, and unless it's being saved for something in particular, the milk can be drunk by anyone who is thirsty, right? The food that's in the fridge will be eaten by everybody. If there's not a lot of food, then everybody has to share. If there's plenty of food, everybody can eat as much as they want. But it's not as if the hamburger is owned by somebody. It's not as if the ketchup is owned by this member of the family. It's all owned by everyone, and you can drink and eat what you need. When there are chores that need to get done, everybody pitches in. Of course, the little children don't do much because they're little children, but as they get older, they're expected to pitch in a little bit more. So your family really ends up looking an awful lot like a communist organization. Now, granted, the house is titled in mom and dad's names. The cars are titled in mom's and dad's names. Mom drives one car and dad drives the other car, and so there's certainly I'm not going to say propriety, but there is certainly a sense that that mom gets the Kia and dad gets the Toyota, or mom gets the sedan and dad gets the Sport Ute, whatever it is. They each have their own car, but on paper they're owned by the whole family. And if one of the cars is totaled and you have to buy another car, it's coming out of the family coffers. It's not just coming out of mom's income. It's not just coming out of dad's incomes. It's coming out of the family's income. So if in most families that have two incomes, one is bigger than the other, does that matter? Not at all, right? If dad makes more than mom, it doesn't matter because it all goes into the same pot. If dad's making 70% of the money and mom's making 30% of the money, that doesn't mean mom gets 30% of the stuff. It means that they use 100% of the money to do what it is the family needs to do. It's a communist organization. The military is a good one. I get a kick out of the military because they vote so Republican. You would never expect anything remotely communist until you start looking at it. What's the job of the military? It's to go kick ass. What tools do you use to kick ass? Well, you use guns. Do you own your rifle? No, it's issued to you, and when you're done, you have to give it back. Do you own the Humvee? Nope, it's issued to you, and you have to give it back. Do you own your backpacks even? Issued to you. Do you own the room you sleep in? Nope, issued to you. So actually, all of the tools you need to do your job in the military are issued to you by the military, right? And if you need something, the military's supposed to meet that need for you. So who would have thought that a bunch of monks in the 6th century and the friggin' military had something in common? Well, in truth, the actual experience of the soldier and the monk aren't going to be that different. They're going to do what they're told to do. They're going to be expected to do it to the best of their ability. If they get hurt, they can expect to have to do a little bit less because they're less able, and they can expect their needs to be met. And in the meantime, they don't own anything. They don't own any of it, if that makes sense. Now, the military is specifically different because it's one arm of the U.S. government, and the U.S. government is its own big mess. But hopefully you get the idea. So that leads us down to tribes. Now, I don't have a ton of experience with tribes. And by that I mean none, because I'm a modern person. But if we were to imagine tribal life 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, before the Europeans and industrialization changed everything, what are we going to find? Well, we're going to find that in a lot of situations, a lot of the important stuff was owned in common, right? Who owned the land that people hunted on? It belonged to that tribe that held that land, right? As long as you were of that tribe, you could probably hunt that land. You didn't have to stick to your little bit here, right? I'm sure you owned some of your particular tools, your bow and arrow, your hoe, like your little day-to-day tools, but the large important things may well have been owned by the tribe. All right. Now, there's one other thing I want you to see. If you look at these 2 pages, okay. So Russia, huge country, hundreds of millions of people. Chinese, huge country, 1 billion people. Family, my family has 4 people. The family I grew up in had 6. Well, 6. All right. A monastery. A monastery might only have 40 or 50 people in it, and 40 or 50 people would be pretty good size. I've known some that have 12. Very, very small. Tribes, you're kind of looking at tribal groups of maybe 250 people before they start separating out into another set of tribes. So all of these communist things were fairly small, whereas these communist failures were fairly large. It may be the case and I'm not saying for sure, but it may be the case that communism is something that works at a small scale less than it works at a large scale. Okay? I'm not saying communism's good. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying capitalism's good. I'm not saying capitalism's bad. There are different ways of running an economy. In that whole discussion, some folks talked about barter. Barter's also a capitalist system. It's just a capitalist system without the abstraction of money to help it work. Okay. So now let's talk about some of the socialist ideas that have worked. Because if there's a fiction in the United States that's left over from the 50s, it's the fiction that communism evil because of the Soviets. And the specific comment that I had made that Terry was talking about was the point about the Icelanders being half communist. What do I actually mean by that? Okay, so there's a lot of the first thing I need to say is that most of our peer nations, most of the nations that we think of as competitors and competitors we'd like to aspire to do as well as or beat, actually are much more socialist or social welfare oriented than we are. What does that mean? Well, it means, in fact, they have government health care. That's good. They have government education. That's good. They have family leave. That's good. Okay. And let me talk a little bit about that. So, all right. Gotta love spell check. All right, so let's talk about that a little bit. So if you paid attention to our conversation about deserving and undeserving, you'll notice that in the United States, it is often a shame if you have to go on government assistance. So someone even talked about a relative who just wouldn't take government assistance even though he deserved it. Deserve. That's a morally laden word, isn't it? Usually if you're getting a housing subsidy in the United States, it's because you're not doing well. If you're getting food subsidies in the United States, you're not doing well. If your children are on Peach Mac, you're not well-to-do. So our systems are all a safety net system, which is fine. It's just a different way to organize it. But our systems are all a safety net system. So if you're cruising along and something happens and you fall out, bam, hopefully the safety net catches you. And that safety net will provide last-ditch health care. Education is a little bit different. It'll provide last-ditch food help. It'll provide last-ditch housing help. Yeah, it's interesting. Okay. I feel like there's, let me make a note here. Where's a pen? Here's a pen. Okay. Okay. There you are. So, let me talk about my experiences with Iceland because I have Icelandic friends. Many of you have international friends, and so it's going to ring a bell. But my Icelandic friends would point out that it wasn't uncommon for a woman to have kids 18, 19, 20, kind of young by American standards. Now, those are young by American standards because if you have a kid at 19, you know what you're not doing? You're not doing college, right? And in fact, that's going to be the story of many of the people in this class. You start life early, it means you put off college. You get to 25, 30, well, you're stuck. What do? Well, you got to go to college then. It's a little bit challenging. All right. So if we look at the Icelandic example, if you have a 20-year-old woman and she's in a relationship and she gets pregnant, how does she pay for her health care? Well, the answer is the government pays for her health care. They provide, and it's not crappy health care, it's good health care. They'll provide prenatal care. They'll provide prenatal care for the mother, vitamins or whatever for the kid. They will, when it comes time for the hospital, she'll go to the hospital and she'll be covered there. In the United States, if you're pregnant and you don't have health care, what do you actually do? Well, you can walk into the emergency room a couple of times during your pregnancy and you might get taken care of. You might be able to find something to some sort of you might go to like a nurse practitioner or a PA who does babies who might help you out. And by help you out, I mean do a cash job in the neighborhood of $3,000 to $4,000. But you're not having the same experience middle-class women are having. And this is key because in Iceland, the middle-class women are having the same experience that the poor women are having. Okay? And that's a very, very different thing. Okay? Now the baby's born. Now what is she going to do? Is she going to work full-time, leave the baby with the stranger, and go to school full-time? The answer is no, she's actually not. So if she's when the baby comes, she'll have a few months of free time off of work. I think for them it was 9 months. And to encourage families to stay together, that's different than the American system too. If dad was involved, dad also got 9 months. So the very first 9 months of the child's life, the mom is supported by the government. Okay? The second 9 months, mom can go to work, mom can go to school, she can do whatever she needs to because then you've got dad to help with the kid. At 18 months, mom and dad can both go back to work and do whatever it was they were doing, and the child doesn't have to get left at some weird stranger's or weird neighbor's house because you can't afford good daycare because the government pays for the daycare. That's somewhere in between healthcare and education. Good quality government daycare kicks in at about 18 months and goes all the way until the kid's old enough for public schools. Now, the public schools are taken care of, very similar to our public schools. That includes high school. It includes college. When I was there teaching a class, the students were complaining about a fee increase because I think the book fee went up like $100 to maybe $200 a semester. So these guys are spending what you're spending on books, they're spending for their whole semester at college. And the books are part of the cost. All right? And if you... Yeah, right? So there's no student loan system. There's no colleges they can't afford to get into. There are colleges they may not be able to get into. There are better colleges and less better colleges. And if you only test into less better, then that's okay. If you test into the most better, that's great. But that's how that's rationed out. Okay. Now, if you are an adult and you think about what stresses you out, you'll notice that the stuff that stresses you out the most is exactly the stuff that Iceland takes care of for their people, right? So how much did your family spend on health insurance last year, and is that actually going to cover you if something bad happens? If you know the facts, that terrifies you, right? Something like half of American bankruptcies, I don't know if the data was from like 2011 or what, but it's a few years old. But the year prior to that, half of the bankruptcies the year before were healthcare costs, okay? And of those, more than half actually had health insurance. So you think because you have health insurance, you're safe, right? When we find that more than a quarter of the people in bankruptcy actually had health insurance and went bankrupt anyway because of healthcare expenses. That's pretty frightening. But that's not a thing that these guys stay up at night worrying about. If you had something that you knew you had to deal with, but you were putting off going to the doctor because you couldn't afford it, and when I think about people in my life that I've heard this story from, it's included weird skin things that could have been looked at as, you don't want to let skin cancer go, right? You don't want to let melanomas go. It includes weird thyroid things. It includes weird, other things. I can think of all sorts of people who aren't going to the doctor because they really just can't afford it now, even if they have insurance. Kind of shocking. That doesn't happen in Iceland, right? Because it's taken care of. It's that's really impressive. If you're a middle class family and you have a child or 2 or 3, then you're worried about their education. If you're in a town that has good public education, that's good. You still got to keep an eye on them. But if you're in a town that doesn't have good public education, that should keep you up at night. It should, because the quality of your child's education has a lot to do with how well he or she is going to do when they get out and become adults. So you're in a town with bad education, what do? Well, you either got to be on top of your child's education, hassling their professors, their teachers, all the time, or you just got to hope that things work out, or you got to cough up $10,000, $12,000 a year per child to send them to one of the private schools around town. Okay, you better get back to work. So healthcare likely keeps you up at night if you're a regular middle class person. Education likely keeps you up at night. And when that kid gets to college, what are you going to do? You don't know what you're going to do you? You hope they get a scholarship, right? Because you can't afford. You know what Notre Dame was last year? I just heard this. $62,000 a year. 62. Let that sink in. So what are you going to do for your child's education? Well, Icelanders don't worry about that, right? And while you're thinking of your child's $62,000 education per year, are your student loans paid off yet? No. So you're worried about that too. Okay, so point being, and you know what, the final one, I hope you're setting some money aside in your 401k, and I hope you're buying a pension. Although whether or not pensions are going to be around when you and I retire, who knows? But we can hope, right? If you're thinking broadly, you'll recognize what's going to happen when you get old. That should probably worry you too. And these are all things that the Icelandic government helps provide for their citizens. But there's a big difference, because it's not well, we know you're poor, we don't want you to have to eat cat food. It's not a shaming helping of the worst off. Oh, you're a failure, maybe we can help you. It's the regular citizens, the middle class citizens, expect everybody to avail themselves of those needs, right? So you don't think of the roads as welfare, do you? And when the roads work, you think, well, they should work. They're supposed to work. That's what we pay the government to do. You don't think of your coal electricity, your dam-run electricity as welfare. It's just what the government's supposed to be doing for us. We pay a government utility. Of course, most of those have been outsourced, but work with me on this. It's something the government's providing for all of us, and it's pretty good. Look at the difference in how education is thought of. If you're in a community that has a less good education system, where everyone who aspires to be middle class second mortgages their home or puts someone to work overnight on a second or third job to try and pay those $10,000 or $12,000 a year private school bills, how good is the education system, right? And a different way of thinking about this, or I guess what I'm trying to do is turn this on its head. If the education system is just for the worst off, the poorest families, how good is that education system going to be, right? To be blunt, if I was sending my kid to Mount DeSalle, how would I care what the local school system did? If anything, I'd want them to do less because it might cost my tax money less, right? But all around this country are excellent public schools in more well-to-do neighborhoods. Now, of course, they have more money to deal with, but think about the difference in the attitude. If the middle-class people and the upper-middle-class people, if really everybody expects their kid to go to a public school, how is the public school going to be able to offer anything less than a decent experience? And the answer is they're not. They're going to do a good job. Okay, so all of the social welfare stuff, Iceland expects their middle-class people to take advantage of. Healthcare is for regular people. Education is for regular people. Family leave is for regular people, right? For us, those are all for their safety net things for the people who are the worst off. And so the quality that's provided, we treat that way, right? Okay, now, this is not to say, again, I'm not trying to sway anybody to make you be capitalist, to make you be communist at all, but I do want to give you a sense that communism is this big thing, which is sometimes political, we're fighting with the Russians, or geopolitical, we're fighting with the Russians. Sometimes it's political as in, how are we going to organize things in the United States? Even when it's a stand-in for social welfare ideas, some social welfare ideas, the Nordic states are a great example, is we're going to make sure that all of our citizens have the basic needs of life, and they have them pretty good. Other social welfare systems are like ours, which are, well, I guess if you have to be on it, it's better than nothing, but not much better, right? So you can't just say, this is good, this is bad. You have to try and understand where you're at in the system. Some systems work better in different situations. Which are you going to use where? Okay. Now, this last point here, of course, with all of the debate about Obamacare and other things in the United States, there's been a lot of talk about various social welfare systems, health being one of them. And if you're listening to the Republican side, who don't tend to usually prefer national healthcare systems, you're going to hear all of these examples of tremendous failures coming from elsewhere. Now, the thing is that there are downsides to any system. There are downsides to our capitalist system, and there are upsides. There are downsides to these guys' social welfare systems. One of them is they are phenomenally expensive. Their taxes, the Icelandic taxes, run about 50%, and a new car has something like 100% tax. I don't know how they afford anything. But then the flip side is they don't spend any time worrying about what I worry about. My Icelandic friend said that if you're poor in Iceland, it means you can't afford your hobbies. Well, hell, I can't afford my hobbies, and I'm not poor. Now, also, I have to say, I've never heard any of the Icelanders I know complain about their system. Usually, what they will say is, what the hell is wrong with you Yanks? They just don't understand why we don't build a better system. Because in their eyes, our system just flat sucks. The closest I've ever heard any of them to being critical was a physician saying that he thought there might be overutilization of the healthcare system because there was no copay. His answer wasn't to privatize the healthcare system. It was to kick up the copay a little bit, to get people to use the system a little more judiciously. That's a pretty weak complaint compared to where we're at. Now, also, finally, this last point here, Reason Magazine is it's the libertarian magazine. And libertarians are hardcore free marketers, small government, get them out of everything. But at least last year, the editor of Reason Magazine, when they had health problems in their family, they went to his spouse's country to get it taken care of, because his spouse's country had a healthcare system, a government healthcare system. And for all of our bitching and whining and picking on them, the editor of Reason Magazine was taking his spouse to France to have their baby. Think about that.